Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to DC Signal to Noise. No fancy open this time, Jim Wiesmeyer, because our producer Eric Crowley is off shooting some commercial content today. So the production values will suffer because you're stuck with me today, Jim.
Yeah, we can handle it.
We can handle it. So a whole lot to get through that may change by the time we end this broadcast today. So for those listening to the podcast later on, please be aware that we're recording this at 2 p.m. Eastern on Friday afternoon. And so we will be talking about the situation as it stands, 2 p.m. Eastern on Friday afternoon. So we'll get into that. Jim, I said this morning on AgriTalk, this particular show, I'm looking forward to comments, questions, and feedback from those watching live on Facebook more than I ever do. Folks, I really want to hear from you today. Because, and Jim, we've talked about this before, but you would geek out watching this stuff. And the most enjoyable part to me is those group texts that we have with you, me, Chip, and Sean Haney. Because we all see things a little bit differently. And
sometimes a lot differently.
Sometimes a lot differently, yeah. But I like how it checks my own perceptions. And so I want that from you out in the audience today. I think Jim would say the same.
Absolutely.
That we really want to hear your feedback, not just questions about what we think about the election, but we want to hear what you think about where things stand right now. And bring that into part of the discussion today, because I think that's going to be very important. So load them up, start commenting now, or sending questions now in the comment section there on Facebook. Jim, I think you and I have talked, we've been actually on here for a little bit talking about topics for today. We're going to get into, obviously, the election, how the rural vote played a huge role in how things played out on election night and election week, as it's turning out to be, how the election is going to impact some of the congressional leadership. You had a big scoop this morning today about the Senate. We're going to get into that a little bit more.
A possible scoop. Possible
scoop.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's big news that even that
they're considered,
that is being discussed. Yeah. And so you have to keep watching to get the details on that. We'll do another round of the parlor game about cabinet posts under what is presumably going to be a Biden administration at this point. Again, nothing declared, but that seems to be where the momentum is headed at the moment. We'll have some more on what's developed this week over EPA and the renewable fuel standard waivers. And also, China has, amidst all of this, has continued to roll this week and seen some pretty impressive price action in the commodity markets and in the stock market this week. So we'll get through all of that. Anything to add to the list? Oh, and renewed hope for some COVID aid, although it may be checked some. We'll talk about that. Anything else to add to the list, Jim?
Well, no, but if the viewers and listeners have a topic, have at us. We'll add it to the list, maybe in a bottom line assessment. But we want to talk about what you want to hear about.
Indeed. And that reminds me, we got an email last night that I need to find again, because I said we'd talk about that, and I can't remember. There it is.
Is that the one with the potential fraud, comment on that?
Yes, that was it. Yep, we will get into that as well. Let me open it up here so I've got it in front of me, so we can get to that a little later on. All right, Jim, you ready to go?
I'm ready.
All right, let me get back to where I can see you. I've got all this other stuff open. All right, here we go. In 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Friday on what has been the longest week of my life, I think, Jim Wiesmeyer. It's time for DC Signal to Noise. I'm John Harris, along with Jim Wiesmeyer from Pro Farmer, and we're going to talk all things election and how all things election this week are going to impact agriculture. And again, for those who are watching us live on Facebook, please post a comment there. Let us know what you'd like to hear us talk about, or provide your own observations about the election week this week. If you're not watching on Facebook, a reminder, if you're listening on the podcast, you can join us live at 2 p.m. Eastern every Friday on the AgriTalk Facebook page and be a part of the show and join in the conversation. So with that, Jim, let's just get to it. First of all, again, we're here at 2 p.m. on Friday Eastern time. So all of our references about the election are going to be framed in that. What is your take on where we stand at this point?
Well, that's why you use likelies in this, but it is likely that Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate, will be announced tentatively as the next president of the United States. Word today, late today, is that he may give a national address at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. That's point one. Point two is there are more than a few court challenges. So, by Trump in a number of the very close states, and some for good reasons, I think. So it looks like we could go into December on a combination of recounts, court challenges, etc., where the courts will need bona fide proof of some of the alleges on the charge front, John.
Yeah, and a couple things on that. One, it says to me that the Biden campaign expects the networks to declare a couple more of these states yet today, that they are making solid plans for an address tonight. I think that they will, that the Biden camp will probably wait as late as they can. If there's not a winner declared by most of the networks by 8 p.m., they may push it back further until that declaration is made. The other thing is that there's a lot of, and we're getting comments about this, about voter fraud. There's a lot of talk about it, but no solid evidence yet. There needs to be evidence brought forward, and obviously, if there is evidence there, investigated fully. But also beyond that, we've got in Georgia and Pennsylvania in particular, the margin is very narrow. And certainly, in fact, the Georgia Secretary of State has already said he expects a recount there. I would anticipate we get a recount in Pennsylvania. And just to get really in the weeds for a second, in Georgia, there has to be less than a half a percentage point difference or margin in the race, and then a candidate can request a recount. So it's not automatic.
And they can get a recount, and even if that's not met, John, they can get a recount, but they have to pay for it.
Right.
Okay, and that's happened, sometimes on all these close states. I think most of them have not yet counted the military provisional ballots. So in some cases, if it's very, very close, that could be a very significant factor in the coming hours or days. I think it's going to take until Sunday for a number of these states to officially announce the results themselves. But of course, we have later on where they certify them. But right, with the court challenges and the recounts, I think we're looking into December, John.
Yeah, and we'll get into what the dynamic plays here in just a minute. But one other quick note on the balloting. The Pennsylvania vote that comes in, the Election Commission of Pennsylvania sent out a directive to segregate the ballots that came in after 8 p.m. on Election Day. You may remember that there was a court challenge on that. Those ballots, the counties were directed to not count those until the very end. So it is my understanding that the vote tallies that we're seeing in Pennsylvania at this point does not include any ballots that came in after 8 p.m. on Election Day. But also, we don't know what that number is. Early indications were they weren't huge numbers. But that is a point that's going to be a centerpiece of one of the court challenges, because that was the state Supreme Court that ruled that because of the COVID situation, that the window should be expanded by 3 days. That was not done by the legislature. So that is going to be something that the U.S. Supreme Court could take up.
Yes. Yeah. Even though they had plenty of time to send in a mail ballot. But I think what this is all going to result, or hopefully should, is a significant look by Congress on a federal basis, the whole topic of early voting and mail-in, ballots, where we have a scatter shot across the U.S. of, different rules for different states. Well, that worked in prior years when we didn't have the significance and the numbers of these early votes and mail-in ballots. But now it was clear to me now that was the Democrats' strategy from the get-go, and it appears to have worked. Now, looking into Georgia now, the two Senate races that look like a runoff on January the 5th, the Republicans probably learned a lot about that, so they'll play that game as well.
Yeah, and let's talk about that for a minute. It looks like just barely both of those races are going to go into a runoff. David Perdue just barely missing that 50% threshold. It would appear to me, Jim, and if you agree, that the Republicans have the advantage in those two seats in Georgia, just because of the timing, and it's going to be more challenging for Democrats to get turnout in that race.
Normally that's the case, but again, these mail-ins make it easier to vote rather than historically where you had to go to the polls. You know what I mean? So, and then it depends on the candidate on that. And of course, now this will be nationalized, both of those races. And although money really did not help the Democratic Party as much as they thought. What is it I saw? I had the numbers written down before. Now, $601 million for all the elections for the Democrats, and just shy of $1 billion for the Democrats. The 601 was for the Republicans. So, but you're going to see a lot of outside money come into the races, plural. And so here we go again, if that's the case, which I think it will be. Right now, most of what you see on the TVs and cables is 48-48. But most people in Washington assume that two outstanding elections for the Senate, Alaska and North Carolina, will likely go to the Republicans. So it's 50-48. That would mean the Democrats would have to win both Georgia runoff races. Possible, but I think unlikely.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about how the two camps proceed from this point. I mean, you've got to see, I imagine we will see Joe Biden proceeding forward as if he has won and start planning transition beyond tonight or tomorrow, whenever a winner is declared in this race.
Yes.
But you also have the Trump campaign trying to project an image that they are still very much in this race and still very much in the White House. So how does that reconcile over there?
I don't think you can reconcile it. It's just rough. If you're a supporter of either side, you're either feeling happy or very sad to upset on the case of Trump. And I'm seeing it in emails and telephone calls. Biden has already put up a transition website, so that tells you where they're going. Okay. He put that up, I think, last night on that. But his initial message, it's clear. He'll be more traditional, where he'll go across the aisle. This is time to, get America back together, things like that. So he's going to be very accommodating, I would think, in his initial address, to send the signal that he's the president of all people, not just the Democratic voters.
All right, Chris sending in a comment saying it's time to teach civics. Again, inexcusable for this to be happening in our country right now. I'm not sure which he means about it inexcusable to be happening, but I do think I would agree with him that there needs to be a greater understanding of the democratic process for a lot of folks in this, and understanding that a lot of what's happening right now isn't unique. It's just being brought forward because the race is so close.
Well, not only because it's close, it's because the function of the votes, John. The COVID did impact how you voted, more so on the Democratic side than the Republican side. I think that Trump made a strategic mistake by browbeating, mail-in votes, and that was clearly the strategy. You can see it across the map on the Democrats to flood the mail ballots and to make sure to get them out and in. And so I think I don't think that's going to change. anymore. And that's why I think Congress should at least try to supervise it better and standardize it better, because we can't have this scattershot across with different dates, etc. But that gets you into states' rights, and that's going to be thrown into courts and all that. So.
Yeah, Article 1 clearly puts the election process in the hands of the state. So yeah, that's a difficult thing to do.
It is.
Well, Roxanne says, I'd like your view on how this affects agriculture. Well, that's what we're all here about. So let's get into it, Jim. We talked, you and I talked with Jeff Cooper for the Renewable Fuels Association this morning on AgriTalk, and he seemed to think that a split government really could be beneficial for renewable fuel corn growers, because it in particular would moderate some of the push from the far left on environmental issues.
Absolutely. Again, under the assumption we're going to have split government. We don't know that for sure, but I think at least odds tilt towards the Republicans retaining control of the Senate, and the House, Democrats in a weakened capacity, narrow margins. I mean, at this juncture, the Republicans gained 8 seats in the House. What does that mean? In a very close presidential race. To get anything done, including agriculture legislation, you're going to have crossing the aisles, working together, kind of the old-fashioned way. That's a good civics lesson right there. And I think that that's probably going to be the case, where the extremes of either party are going to be not blocked out totally, but they're going to become less important in order to seek a consensus, viewpoint on a host of legislations: energy, agriculture, trade, etc. So, and again, that also means from an agriculture perspective, you will not have the end of the filibuster in the Senate, as some conjectured that a trifecta for the Democrats, would have happened. You won't have packing the courts, because you would have the Senate, defeat that. Yeah, you just don't have the votes. You won't have the initiative for two new states, DC and Puerto Rico. So, what does that mean? It means a more status quo with not many changes, other than what Biden will do in a significant way in the executive orders, like Obama and Trump did, and re-regulation in some cases. So we could see more regulations in the ag arena coming out. But other than that, and this is what the markets are speaking to us, the equity markets.
Yeah, they've responded strongly.
And so they didn't want, and from a tax policy, that would have definitely hit big agriculture and businesses in the rural sector, with Biden's corporate tax increase, rather large, capital gains, estate taxes, etc. So, and then this really pushes down any movement toward whatever you want to call it, major climate change legislation, because the votes will not be there in the Senate for any major change unless there's consensus between the two parties.
Indeed. Circling back, though, to your notion that it's going to force the two sides to work together, my question is there anybody left in Congress with experience in doing that? I mean, we lost the line to that election with Colin Peterson. Is there anybody left there that really has the ability and the experience to reach across the aisle and get legislation done?
Well, if Biden is indeed the president, his history showed him when he was in the Senate, he would cross the aisle. So he was an accommodator. I don't know whether he's changed that much, but I think that he will not be.
No, but what about in Congress?
In Congress, you'll have humbled House Democrats seeking, looking at what happened, where they almost lost control of the chamber. So I think once you get a shock like that, you'll tend to open your ears a little bit more. You have on the Democratic side in the Senate, Manchin from West Virginia, Rubio, I think, from Florida is a consensus builder. There are more than people think. Not a lot, but there's enough. And Mitch McConnell is majority leader, just like us. He likes a centrist position. He doesn't like strident views on either side. So there's at least the possibility, John. I think in agriculture, a transportation bill That's going to be a test now, because can they come together on a major transportation bill from a funding mechanism? That's going to be harder now than I think it would have been the case had Democrats run the table, because of the sudden focus in the Senate now amongst the Republicans about this growing deficit and debt, John.
Yeah, Senate Republicans are suddenly going to become penny pinchers on just about everything, aren't they?
Yes. And we didn't say it yet, but I was told this morning that the Republicans, to avoid any potential shock out of these coming Georgia runoff races, are in back channels, are talking with, Senator Manchin from West Virginia, Democrat, in a state that went almost 70-30 for Trump. They're talking to him, trying to woo him to change political parties. Now, when they asked him to do that several years ago, he said no. And I asked one Republican, well, what are you offering him? And the message I basically got was re-election, because while he's not up for 4 years, when you look at that 70-30 split, he's probably looking at the same numbers. I'm not saying he's going to do it, but watch that story break in the news over the next few days as others hear what I've been hearing. And that would be kind of a guard against any 50-50 Senate, because if it's 50-50 and Biden wins the White House, that would be controlled by the Democrats, because vice president breaks ties. That's another civics lesson.
Yeah, but as you've pointed out before, on a lot of these key issues, there would probably be some defections among the Democrats, and Manchin is one we brought up. And let's face it, switching parties for him would not be a huge move for him. He's voted with the Trump administration on a few key issues.
Yes, and he gave word that he didn't want to end the filibuster, so the Democrats would not have got his vote on that. I can't remember his position on the Federal Reserve, but I doubt that he would have wanted to pack it. So, yeah, I think his head's there. Whether or not he's got the mojo to change parties, because that's a major move there. But I was in.
They got to get the heart and the donors.
Yeah, I was
Probably
in
not
West
in that
Virginia.
order.
I was in West Virginia a couple of weeks ago, and that definitely is Trump territory. Because when I asked one of the drivers that took me and David Wasserman of the Cook Political Report to the resort we went to, the Greenbrier, I asked him, what about the battle between Trump and Biden? And he said, who's Biden? So that's kind of the reflection you hear in West Virginia. I just think it's an interesting thing to watch. Again, I can't predict, at this particular time, but I'm hearing it from pretty good sources that the attempts are being made and will continue to be made.
That is interesting. The Trump administration has dramatically changed ag policy in the United States through the market facilitation program, the coronavirus food assistance program. That is going to change under a Biden administration, which, again, we're not making any presumptions, but that seems to be where the momentum is headed right now. So we're going to talk about a future with the Biden administration. So, Jim, how does that outside of the Farm Bill, farm policy change and adapt with a change in administration?
I think they'll throw it to Congress. A Biden would typically go to the congressional route and say, Senate and House ag committees, work it out and give me some proposals if additional aid is needed. Now, coming up in the lame duck session, Mitch McConnell, right now, the Senate Majority Leader, is saying one of his top priorities during the lame duck session, they come back Monday, is included in that is COVID aid and stimulus aid. But he didn't say the top level dollar, but I can imagine he'd just go back to what it was before the election, where it was even going to be hard to get a $500 billion aid package passed in the Senate, because 15 to 20 of his colleagues in the Senate was saying, enough already.
Yeah, but isn't the fact that he's sending smoke signals right now, doesn't that lead you to believe that it's going to come up a little bit over that $500 billion?
What's a little, but yes, I agree. But it's what's little in this town. And that what'll be $1 trillion? I don't think so. No.
Well, and you and I were talking about this before we went on air. It seems to be, in hindsight, a big tactical error for Speaker Pelosi when she was being offered $1.8 billion from the White House, and she kept insisting on the $2.2 billion. And in hindsight, that seems like a real tactical error for her, because she thought she was going to run out the clock and the Democrats were going to run the table, and that hasn't happened. And now she's largely at the mercy of Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, she is. But I think where she was going from is internally, she probably knew that Mitch McConnell would not put on a floor a bill of $1.8 to $1.9 trillion. So she went under that, I think, assumption to, run the tables on the election. And she held a press conference this morning and she said, well, they won the war, but lost more than a few battles. And she said Trump had down ballot coattails in the House. And when you look at those House races, John, the rural vote was very key in more than a few of them. And even in the Senate, the big surprise, although we conjectured about this race, I think, on Signal to Noise, on Susan Collins in Maine, that she would probably pull it out before most people thought. The rural areas in Maine definitely helped Susan Collins. So all those efforts by Tom Vilsack and other Democrats to try to encroach on the typical margin that the Republicans have in the Republican Party, it just did not work. In fact, it looks like, I haven't done all my analysis, but it looks like the rural vote increased for the Republican Party rather than decreased. And so Democrats are going to have to go back to the table. Bottom line, the House Republicans are going to pick up more than a few seats, 8 so far already. Democrats failed to flip a single state legislative chamber. So think about redistricting impacts there. And so you can see it for that rural vote. And that's why we had that 3-hour plus Democratic caucus last night that's getting a lot of media play in the New York Times and the Washington Post, where Representative Spanberger, who's from my state now in Virginia, had at her Democratic colleagues because she chastised them for, quote, embracing the defund the police movement. We should never as a party use the word socialist or socialism ever again. And so that was pretty biting. So the Democrats are going to have to soul search again.
Yep, indeed. Clinton Griffiths from Ag Day and the Farm Journal editor this week talked to one of Tyson Redpath's associates there at the Russell Group, and her name is escaping me at the moment. But she said the data she was looking at said that the rural voters were almost solely responsible for rolling back the red wave or the blue wave of 2018, going all the way down into state legislature elections.
I agree. I agree with that. And so that's why you're going to see the Republicans still, from a legislative standpoint, that's one of their key constituent groups. And the Democrats are not going to revenge on them, but they're going to say, hey, we got to go along with this because we've got to break into that. And Trump even won some areas where, remember when we had the split ticket argument? Well, that happened in Maine. But, when Wasserman from Cook Political Report, who was wrong on the House races big time. So I've talked to him. He felt, very bad about it. He wrote today, the suburban anti-Trump revolt that took 2018 by storm did not extend to this year. Most Republican incumbents in white-collar suburbs didn't just survive, they thrived, running well ahead of Trump down ballot. It may have helped that, unlike 2018, when those voters' only opportunity to express displeasure with Trump was in congressional races, they were able to split their tickets this year. Now, isn't that interesting? I think he's right there. I think he's right. You always are better as an analyst when you miss something than when you get something. So I'm going to listen to those analysts who actually were wrong to see, number one, if they admit they were wrong, and two, and they should, and two, why were they wrong? And now we're seeing some of this.
Well, I think a part that plays into that too is everything in the modeling for the 2020 election is based off of 2016 results. Well, we're going to end up with probably 40 million more votes in 2020 than we had in 2016. So that really, that impacts that modeling tremendously.
Yes. And Biden had more votes than any other president in the history of this great country. Yeah. And Trump, number 2, he beat Obama. So that tells you, I think Trump probably helped bring 8 million more, voters to the booths, et cetera. So, yeah, we've got, these are the types of analysis that we'll be seeing in the days and weeks ahead.
All right, let's get into some of the questions coming in here on the comments. And again, if you're watching us on Facebook, drop a comment in there or a question. Let us know what you want us to talk about or your observations on the election, in particular, how it impacts agriculture. This coming in from Pat says, are establishment Republicans just sitting back and smiling and thinking they can regain control in 2 or 4 years? I guess my initial response, Jim, is I don't know that there are many establishment Republicans, and certainly not no, I'm serious. And I'm speaking as somebody who worked for 2 establishment Republican governors in the state of Illinois. So, I fall in there. I don't think there are many left. There's certainly not a marquee name to lead an establishment Republican effort at this point.
Yeah, well, I don't think the Republicans are going to sit back. Now, I do think that they have a strategy now to where the numbers in the House would tend to indicate that the Republicans could well flip the House in 2022, because history shows, just like baseball with the stats, history shows that a new administration's first midterm elections, they typically, not all the time, they typically lose seats in both the House for sure and the Senate. So I don't think that they want to lay back on that one. I think we're going to see the return somewhat of the Republicans rather than the populist flavor that President Trump brought to the party. Not substantially, but I think you're going to see it, John, somewhat in the return to fiscal responsibility and things like that. That's what I mean by the return of normal, a historical, Republican creed.
I hope you're right, Jim. I hope you're right. But let's face it, a part of this is going to be what kind of role Donald Trump continues to play in the Republican Party.
Yes, and for ag impacts, personnel is policy. So let's go first in Congress. You're going to have 3 changes in 3 out of the top 4 positions on the House and Senate Ag committees. In the Senate, we're going to have John Bolzman as the new Senate Ag Committee chairman, assuming the Republicans retain control of the Senate. He's a Republican from Arkansas. He's a consensus builder. Whenever you're from the South, you have to deal with your northern brethrens. And then you had and he'll replace Pat Roberts, who was somewhat moderate when you look back at as his career. And then on the House side, it's unknown because of Peterson's defeat by double digits, by the way. Yeah. It's going to be a race between 3, it looks like the 3, people in seniority positions on it. David Scott, Georgia. Then you have Jim Costa from Florida and Marcia Fudge from the Cleveland area of Ohio. Now, Democrats usually go on seniority, but Marcia Fudge is on the list of a potential USDA secretary. So you have to look at that.
Indeed. In fact, a question here plays into that from Roxanne asking, do you think this is going to affect dairy and beef industry? Well, that Colin Peterson loss is indeed going to affect the dairy industry in particular. He has been a huge champion for the dairy industry and probably knows dairy policy better than anybody else on the Hill. That's not to say that his replacement, Fishbach, isn't going to be a fighter for agriculture, but she doesn't have yet, as a freshman coming in, doesn't carry the weight that a Colin Peterson does. Yeah,
but Peterson made sure in the 2018 Farm Bill that dairy had a far better policy structure than it did in 2014. because he heard from his constituents that they didn't like the 2014, dairy safety net. So I'm not saying you don't need to have any changes in dairy policy, but I think agriculture is going to hopefully go back to the more historical bipartisan approach in farm policy. We really haven't seen that really the last few years. It got pretty bitter. You had whatever USDA done. Stabenow, who's the ranking member on the Senate Ag Committee, put out a press release shortly thereafter pounding them on it. But I want to see at least the potential for going across the aisles to get some things done. But bottom line, dairy has bipartisan support when you look at throughout the U.S. There's a cow in every state, okay? Remember that. And so I think that they'll listen to both sides. So I'm not worried about the dairy policy.
But another potential big impact on dairy and beef combined is, and you talked about this earlier in the show, having a mixed leadership in Washington moderates any effort by the left on environmental policy. So that's going to be good news for the beef and dairy industry.
Yes, and on payment limitations, a number of Democrats historically would want to lower the payment limitations. I don't see that passing muster in the Senate. Crop insurance not only has wide bipartisan support, but any efforts to really dig into the program that really works. Of course, anything can be improved, but I see low chances of any significant changes in crop insurance policy, at least for the next few years, the next Congress.
All right. Our buddy Sean Haney up in Canada checking in with what can the EU, Canada, and the UK expect from a possible Biden presidency on trade? I think the bigger question is what can China expect from a Biden presidency trade? I think that's what most of agriculture in the U.S. is looking at, but I'll let you take on all of them, Jim.
Yeah, personnel is policy, as I'll say it again. So who's going to be that top spot? The Democrats have a good farm club. They've got Darcy Vetter, who was high ranking in the U.S. Trade Rep's office before. I would put former top USDA economist Joe Glauber in the running for potential U.S. trade. Oh, yes. He always had been detailed, even when he was at USDA in his, quote, younger days. Joe, if you're listening, he went over to Geneva a lot of times. His miles, like you wouldn't believe, he had airline miles when you could fly. But the Democrats have a long list of potential USTR personnel. I don't think Biden's going to focus overtly on trade policy, say his first 6 months in office, but he has already indicated that he wants to rejoin whatever the CPTPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, but that's going to take some time. He'll take a more multilateral approach, on trade agreements, but on China, I don't see much wiggle room than what we have right now. He'll try to seek his consensus within our major allies, but I think he's got to prove tough on China because he actually campaigned on that. Again, watch your personnel and watch their pedigree of who's going to be at the U.S. Trade Rep's office and the ag trade spots at USDA as well, because they work closely together, and who's the top ag rep at the U.S. Trade Representative.
Now, earlier you had given us a heads up that there was a possibility that Robert Lighthizer may stick around at least for a period of time at USTR. Are you saying that's off the table now?
I haven't had time to check on that, but that was first broached as a possibility by the Financial Times of London. And frankly, I always like when I get information from papers outside of this country. I think they're less emotional, sometimes emotional, but less emotional, and they're more unbiased than many of our newspapers are in this country. And I don't like saying that.
All right. I think something that will play into this relationship with Canada in particular, though, is we do know that a President Biden is going to look for some global partners in taking on China and Russia in particular. So I would imagine that means that the U.S. is going to seek a closer partnership and probably completely eliminating the remnants of the threat of aluminum tariffs on Canada and some of those things in order to strengthen that partnership, in order to go hand in hand against China.
That makes sense. And then, but remember, for a timeline, the Fast Track Trade Authority, TBA, expires July of next year. So to get any new trade agreements, you really have to have that authority, because then that makes the voting on a new trade agreement an up and down vote. You cannot amend it. So that's critical. So to get that, you're going to have to get a consensus. Also, watch House Democrats really, they signaled this right before the election. They're going to zero in on both Mexico and Canada. Sean, I know you probably realize this, in the fulfillment of some of the terms of dairy in the U.S. USMCA agreement, and in Mexico, the labor and environmental standards. And I don't see the Democrats backing away from that. They're going to be very aggressive in hearings and letters into their president now, implementation of USMCA. So watch that in the first few months of the new Congress and the conjectured, Biden administration.
All right, question coming in here from Pat. Is Biden for or against the commodity checkoffs? I haven't seen him make a statement either way on that. Have you, Jim?
No, I have not. But usually more traditional. The old Biden, I think, would have been for checkoffs, because he's a believer in market development and research and things like that. So, but I'd have to recheck it. But I don't see substantial changes right now in the checkoff system. I don't see substantial changes in almost anything other than the executive order route and re-regulation, because of the split government. And I think that's the market signaling that, we kind of like that. We won't get, changes all the time, or the uncertainty. And so that's not bad. We've had a whirlwind of changes the last few years.
Yeah, and Pat also asks now about cool country of origin labeling. It was on the table for Democrats in the campaign. I think it's probably off the table now with the split Congress.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Senate is going to neuter some of the initiatives that a trifecta Democrat administration or Washington, would have, pursued.
All right. So let's get back a little bit into the politics of this, Jim, and talk about if there's a price to be paid by House and Senate leadership in this. Let's start with the House and Nancy Pelosi. Let's face it, Tuesday was a big loss for her. They were projecting gains in the House. They were projecting the Democrats were going to regain the Senate. Just the opposite happened up and down the ballot. As we mentioned before, even venturing into state legislature races, which obviously is in Pelosi's purview, but it indicates that there was no huge Democrat push in this election. How much does that weaken her position going into the new Congress?
I think it weakens it a lot. Of course, she will never say that, but you could tell from that 3-hour raucous caucus that occurred last night. She heard it. So they're going to have to change. I don't know whether she'll be significantly challenged for the speakership. I don't know whether she'll say, she's already said this is her last Congress coming up. Right. Maybe she'll cut that in half. I think if she was smart, she would do that. She'd bow out after 1 year as a kind of a compromise. But that's just me. But we were on live on election night, and we all really had fun. It challenged us all. One thing was the House races. It's hard to analyze House races when you're on a live program, especially on election night, and especially when you had a topsy-turvy result that was not expected, at least from the so-called election experts. And we had a little discussion whether or not, if the Republicans would have lost more seats in the House, what that would mean for Kevin McCarthy, who is the minority leader for the Republicans in the House. Well, now he looks very good, and there's no chance Kevin McCarthy is going to be bumped out of his minority leadership position. So I wanted to update that, aspect. On the Democrat side, if they're smart, you lick your wounds, you change, and you listen to the voters. And what the voters said clearly is that Trump had coattails. These are people, yeah, and you better start knowing them, because it was the elitist aspect of this town again that came through in a number of areas, not only in the House, but in some cases the Senate. But so I think the people, that's why I love elections. They, the people spoke. And so I think the Democrats are going to be chagrined.
Yeah, and the tags of socialism hit much harder than anybody anticipated.
Absolutely. And see, Trump tried to get that into a national debate. He succeeded in the representative race. He succeeded in Florida because of the Cuban American vote. And that's another aspect. Look at the Black American vote. We speculated on this program. I told you the Republican sources I had in the White House said that Trump, who got 8% of the Black American vote in 2016, wanted 10 to 14%. He got, I think, right around 12%. That was huge for him. Big. And he got
for any Republican.
And Hispanic vote, it looks like in the 30s. That's significant. And so the Republican Party will want to build on that. Now, is it just Trump, see? Or is it the party? So that's what's going to be a big unknown. The earlier question, will the Republicans just sit back? They better not. They better, because Trump, Trump could be on the ticket in 2024, but not 2022. But we're going to have to see the rise of a new leader in the Republican Party.
Yeah, we are. And it'll be interesting to see who that is that comes forward to take that mantle, and how challenging it is to take that mantle with Donald Trump still, if he chooses to still try to stay relevant in the Republican Party. That could be an uphill battle for somebody.
Well, the rumor is that he's going to create a cable program, but trust me, he'll be on that program a lot. So, and Fox News has said, "Bring on, we like competition." But it's just going to be curious. It's also going to be curious to watch MSNBC, CNN, and things, and New York Times and Washington Post. They won't have much to write about anymore, other than praising Biden, left and right. But they're going to see, it's going to be boring in a number of cases, because Biden has already said, don't expect a lot of tweets out of him.
Yeah, indeed. And I think no matter which side of the aisle you fall on, we'll like a president who doesn't tweet as much.
A lot of emails, John, I get on who's the potential ag secretary if Biden does win. And I know I call it a parlor game. I really don't like getting into it, but of course I do. Some of the list, and I remember when Clinton was first president, nobody had Mike Espy on their list. And some people listed 25 potentials and were embarrassed when it was Mike Espy initially from Mississippi, who lost a Senate Mississippi race.
Yeah, he wasn't on the list Tuesday night either.
Yeah, but some potentials, you always look for defeated lawmakers. So Colin Peterson, of course, would be on the short list. But number one, I don't know whether he wants it. And number two, it's hard work. And not saying he can't be hard work, but it's a lot of travel. Two is he's very moderate, definitely moderate for a Democrat. So I know that the party may have some questions about that. Krista Harden.
Yeah, but he would sail through confirmation.
Oh, there's no doubt. There's no doubt he would sail through. Yes. And that could be a ploy. That could be not a ploy. That could be a strategy, because, what did you say this morning? That McConnell has said that he wants centrist.
Yeah, wants centrist. He wants to approve centrist. Yeah.
Yeah. And definitely Peterson would be a centrist, that he's knowledgeable, well-liked in the commodity groups, farmers, sugar beet growers, the biggest sugar beet growing district in the U.S., no doubt about it. The hardest thing would be to get him proposed by Biden, because there's a lot of tussle behind the scenes that we're going to be, listening to in the weeks ahead. Another one is Krista Harden. She was the former chief of staff for Tom Vilsack, former USDA secretary, and who was an ag advisor to the Biden campaign. And she was also deputy secretary in the waning days of the Obama administration. You always have to put Michael Skuse on the list.
Before you move away from Krista Harden, Tom Vilsack has a big chip to cash in with this campaign. He's been out front and center working for Biden. Does he cash in that chip for Krista Harden?
Well, I'll let Tom Vilsack speak for himself, but I would conjecture that he would want Krista Harden. And by the way, she is well respected in this town from both, from both sides of the political aisle. Yes. She is a good listener and she knows her stuff, and that's why you don't
knows the agency.
Yes, and you don't become, and she was before even for that congressional liaison, so she knows a lot of lawmakers, and she wasn't seen as an ideologue person. So she has some high marks on her. I won't be surprised at all if she's announced, and she likes the food policy area as well. Michael Skuse is a former USDA undersecretary in the Obama administration. He just happens to be from Delaware, of course, where Biden's from, and he's currently serves as secretary of the Delaware Department of Agriculture. So it looks like there's pressures to announce a female, perhaps a minority female for that position, but we'll see. But he's always got his pedigree at USDA. Anything on Skuse?
Nothing on Skuse, but talk about your push for female. That takes us to Martha Fudge, doesn't it?
Martha Fudge, yes. She of course won her re-election, area near Cleveland, and she would be the first Black American woman to head the House Ag Committee. Well, first Black person to head the House Ag Committee. She's got the Congressional Black Caucus pushing her, as well as David Scott from Georgia. And if it would be Marcia Fudge, she would definitely shift the focus. Her focus has been, nutrition issues, food safety issues, food stamp issues, etc. And that's why I think she would be a better fit, frankly, at USDA as opposed to the House Ag Committee chairwoman, because, shifting the focus from production agriculture to nutrition issues is not a signal on the bipartisan side, John.
No, indeed. In fact, we saw some issues like that. We talked about this morning on AgriTalk with Tom Vilsack when he first came in as USDA secretary, and there was a decided focus away from production agriculture, and eventually he came around and probably became very effective on production agriculture, but it took a little while to get there.
It took a little while. He's very articulate. I always measure people how they grow in their jobs, and he grew, I think, into a giant. Because he learned again from his mistakes, and he learned the significance of grassroots agriculture. And he learned it the hard way. So,
but he learned quickly, very quickly.
Yes. He self-corrected and did a great job. Heidi Heitkamp, who was defeated a while back in North Dakota Democrat. She served on the Senate Ag Committee from 2013 to 2019, and President Trump at least had her under consideration for his USDA helm in the early days of his group. Now, that probably going to hurt her on that one, but she's on the short list that you hear from most people. Anything on Heidi from you?
Nope. Anybody else on that list?
Beth Ford, she's the CEO of Land of Lakes. Now, she's not on a lot of lists, but that's what I'm hearing from insiders. And to me, anybody who works for either association or private industry has one glorious mark in favor of them because they know risk. They know that policy decisions cuts both ways. So I always like when people like her, come into government. And the one that's really getting some talk now is potential Representative Sherry Bustos, Democrat from Illinois. She was in a very close re-election race in Illinois, and
probably shouldn't have been.
Yeah, well, that shows you the issues in the Democratic Party that played against her, I think, in that area. And but she also led the House effort along with Pelosi for the Democrats. So she's not feeling good today. Okay. And so this would be a palatable way, I guess, of putting her over at USDA. Now, key sources tell me that she wants to lead USDA. So she is apparently, yeah, I'm not going to call her and ask her. You just don't do that, you know.
No,
but I was, I just don't do things like that. But
like I might.
Yeah, but that could be a way out of a sticky situation, that to get a new person in over the 2022 House reelection campaign and then have a nice spot for her in the cabinet. So again, all conjecture, but these I think are any one of these would be good for agriculture. I think in most cases, they know production agriculture quite well. And I think that's the biggest litmus test I have. That, and do they understand the risk in policy that the farmers and ranchers have? And agribusiness industry. I don't want to ever leave them out, because there's a lot in the regulatory side and et cetera. So I don't know whether any of the listeners or viewers have any other people they've heard. So you may want to tell us, because grassroots helps there. I know in the case of Johans, I got the initial scoop on Johans from a hog producer in Nebraska. So really? Never underestimate the grassroots if you're a writer, analyst, reporter.
Speaking of the grassroots, we're going to wrap up here in just a few minutes, but I want to give in the last call. If you have a comment or question, be sure to drop it there so we can address it before we get done. Including one more from Pat, says, what can Trump accomplish before January 20th? I think we're going to see a flurry of executive orders, aren't we, Jim?
Yeah, for signals, if nothing else, because you can flip them right back. I think they're getting into a time element for the execution, however, of those, even from a regulatory position. So there's procedures in place. But Trump, I mean, and I don't blame him. He's going to make sure that he uses all aspects in his power to make sure this election was on the up and up. So you're going to go into December. It'll be curious how he phases that. But I don't see him laying down on this one. And before I forget, John, EPA would be key for the Biden administration, and whether or not he will have a climate czar or whatever they're going to call it remains to be seen, now that they looks like they won't control the Senate. So what we heard this morning on AgriTalk is someone that I've talked about for months on the EPA side on Biden would be Mary Nichols. She's now head of CARB out in California. But when I was a true beat reporter, having to file stories from a wire service and things like that, she was high level at the EPA. And let me tell you, I saw her behind the scenes, and she was not a fan of corn-based ethanol. But we heard on AgriTalk, however, that she's a proposal of low carbon,
low
biofuels
carbon fuel initiative,
Yeah, so maybe she has changed, and so I don't see a total attacks, at least right away, from even if she is announced, because of the sensitivity of the renewable fuel standard in the elections. You saw that in Iowa, so let the voter beware.
All right, Rachel, thanks so much for your kind words there. And with that, Jim, I'm not going to ask you where you're watching for signal this week. We know where everyone is watching for signal in the coming hours and days. Do you think we have a declared winner by the end of tonight?
I think, well, you always go on your best sources, and the word, do I think we'll have a declared winner? Ooh. Yeah. By Sunday, I'm sorry, I have to caveat. By Sunday, I know it depends when these states do the last of the vote counting that they feel comfortable in calling it. So as soon as tonight, if not sometime Sunday, or over the weekend. But I think by the time we go to work Monday, we'll know. But so I really think Biden would want to have it announced tonight before
Yeah.
he addressed the nation, because other than that, it's going a little too aggressive. So I get, usually my rule of thumb, if you hear confirmed that Biden's going to address the nation, and in this
Look for
case,
the network
NBC
to
will let him
confirm
talk.
something.
Yeah. Then that's usually an indication that they know that something's going to be called. Yeah.
Yep, indeed. All right. Well, hey, Jim, thanks for helping us sort through all everything that's happened this week and the conjecture on what may happen in the coming weeks. Really appreciate it. And we'll be back for more of it next Friday. So again, if you're listening on the podcast, be sure to join the AgriTalk Facebook page Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern when we do this thing live, and you can send us your questions and comments while we're gabbing. So thanks, Jim.
Anytime.
And we'll talk to you next week. This is DC Signal to Noise.